Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaste. Now that we know that there are species that are under the threat of extinction, what can we do to conserve them? What are the ecological processes that we can use, or what are the conservation strategies that we can use to protect those species to save them from the brink of extinction? So, in this context, we have two different kinds of strategies, which are in situ conservation and ex situ conservation. And in today's lecture, we will have a look at in situ conservation. As always, we begin with the word roots. In situ means on site. So, this is conservation that is done within the natural habitat. On the other hand, ex situ conservation, ex situ means off site, which is conservation that is done outside the natural habitat. So, in situ conservation would be conservation that you are doing within the natural habitat. So, things such as national parks, wildlife sanctuaries come under in situ conservation, because you already have organisms that are living in those areas, and so you are conserving the organisms on the site. Ex situ conservation is when you are trying to conserve the organisms outside their natural habitat. So, if you are setting up a seed bank and taking out seeds from the natural habitat and storing them there in the seed bank, so that if something happens to the natural habitat, you can use the seeds, bring them to the natural habitat, and you can regrow the plants back. So, that would be an example of an ex situ conservation. Or things such as zoos. So, you have a zoo in Delhi. So, those animals are not naturally living in Delhi, but they have been brought from different areas of India and different areas of the world, and then they are kept in the Delhi zoo. So, zoos are an example of ex situ conservation. So, the process of in situ conservation would be that areas in the natural habitat are designated as reserves, national parks, or protected areas. So, you classify the natural habitats, or you look for those areas in the natural habitat that you can classify as reserves, national parks, or protected areas. And then in these areas, ecological monitoring and interventions, that is active management, are done, and legislations are required to maintain these areas as protected areas. So, what you are doing is you are taking out some areas of the natural habitat, and you are saying that these areas will be protected areas. You are putting up some legislations so that people are not able to intervene into these areas, or people are not able to divert these areas for some other applications. And once you have done that, you do habitat monitoring and some amount of interventions. Now, these interventions could be, say, if you are observing that the wild dog population in your area, in the natural habitat, is going down. So, then you would ask the question, what is the reason? Probably your wild dogs are not getting enough amount of food, or probably they are suffering from some disease. So, the intervention in this case would be to intervene at the level of food or at the level of disease. So, suppose they have some disease, so you might give them some antibiotics, or maybe you could try to vaccinate them if that disease is leading to a high amount of death rate, and so on. So, that is the process of in situ conservation. Whereas, in the case of ex situ conservation, you designate areas with suitable conditions and facilities are created in those areas. So, when you are setting up a zoo, you designate certain area in your city or outside your city, and you say that, okay, we are going to construct this zoo here. Then you create facilities in those areas. So, you create enclosures, you create pathways so that people can come visit these areas. You create pathways through which feed will be brought for these animals. You create pathways so that where you can bring in more animals from outside, or maybe take some animals outside. You create facilities in terms of veterinary care. What are those designated areas in your zoo where if an animal is suffering from a disease, you can take it out and give it some amount of veterinary treatment. So, all these facilities are created, and once you have these facilities, the species are moved into these designated areas for their survival and breeding. In a number of areas, you also do captive breeding of these animals. And then the third stage is optional, when the species are later released into their natural habitats. So, that is the ex situ conservation. Now, in situ conservation gives us certain amount of advantages over the ex situ conservation, and at the same time it also suffers from certain disadvantages as compared to the ex situ conservation. So, when we are talking about in situ conservation, you can think about say a tiger reserve. But should you keep a tiger in a tiger reserve, or should you keep a tiger in a zoo? In both the instances, we are trying to conserve the tiger. Now, if you are keeping it in a tiger reserve, it would give you certain advantages. Species continue to live in their natural environment. A zoo is an artificial environment, whereas a tiger reserve is a natural environment. It is less disruptive and less costly. So, you are not required to take the animal away. So, if you are taking a tiger out of a forest area and to keep it into a zoo, you need to engage a number of people. This tiger will have to be immobilized and then put into a cage and then transported to another location, and then once it has been moved into a zoo, then it will have to be fed, and all these feeding arrangements will also require quite a lot of cost. Whereas, if you are keeping it in the natural environment, the tiger is going to hunt by itself. You do not have to go there and feed this tiger every day. So, it is less disruptive and less costly. Also, natural behaviors are maintained. If you have tigers that are living in the wild conditions, in those situations the cubs that are born will be trained by their mothers on how to hunt. They will remember and they will learn these processes of hunting, whereas if you are keeping a tiger in a zoo, so a tiger will very easily forget how to hunt, because it is getting food in a pre-made format. So, the animal is already killed and probably already cleaned before giving it to the tiger. So, it will lose out its natural behaviors very easily. Protection of natural habitat provides protection to other species as well. So, in the case of a tiger reserve, when you are protecting the tigers, you are at the same time also protecting the cheetahs, the sambars and a number of other species, leopards and so on, by protecting the tigers. Whereas, in the case of ex situ conservation, if you are keeping it in the zoo, so if you are only keeping a tiger in the zoo, then in that case you are not protecting the other organisms. Now, even in the case of ex situ conservation, the animal will need to be released somewhere, because if you are keeping tigers in a zoo, you are doing captive breeding, and from say 5 tigers, now you have 50 tigers. Now, if you have 50 tigers, what do you do with these 50 tigers? They will have to be released somewhere, because keeping a tiger is extremely costly. And if you have in situ conservation sites, then these sites will provide suitable areas for such releases later on. So, which is also why you need to maintain in situ conservation areas as well. And also, reserves double as places for scientific studies and public awareness, which is also why we keep in situ conservation methods. However, it also suffers from certain disadvantages. It requires very large areas. So, in the case of tiger reserves, it will have tens or even hundreds of square kilometers of area, whereas to have a zoo, you might set up a zoo in a very small area, say a few square kilometers. So, in situ conservation has this disadvantage that it requires a very large area. Also, less intensive protection and management, because the areas may be encroached upon or the animals posed. So, here we have the classic example, should you keep all your eggs in one basket or should you keep your eggs in different baskets. In the case of a zoo, when you have all the animals in a very small area, you can give a very good amount of protection to those few number of animals, whereas if you are keeping the animals in very large size forest, so you cannot be there in the forest at all places at all times. So, it is possible that that some poachers might get inside and poach some of the animals, or maybe some people would try to encroach upon some areas of the forest. So, that is a possibility, so which is there in the in situ conservation. Then there is a threat of diseases and disasters, because your level of intervention in the case of in situ conservation will not be very high, whereas in the case of a zoo, a disease is much easily controlled, because you have access to all the different animals. So, you can give medicines to all different animals on all days, whereas in the case of in situ conservation, that is not possible. And also, large establishment is required in each case. If you want to maintain a tiger reserve, so you will require a large number of forest guards, a large number of rangers, some SDOs, some DFOs and so on, whereas in the case of a zoo, the level of establishment is not that high, because it is a smaller facility. Now, if we are trying to go with in situ conservation, so in this lecture we will concentrate on in situ conservation. So, if we are going with in situ conservation, what should be our strategies? So, basically we are asking the question, where should we make these reserves? We said that we wanted to create these in situ conservation reserves, we want to make a tiger reserve. Where should we have this tiger reserve? Second, what should be the size and shape of these reserves? Is there any ecological concept through which we can determine what should be the shape and size of this reserve. Should we have large reserves, should we have smaller reserves, or should we have reserves that are say linear, or reserves that are circular, or reserves that are square in size or square in shape. What should be the size and shape of the reserves? What are the ecological principles through which these would be guided? And third question is, how are we going to manage these reserves? So we begin with where to make the reserves. So traditionally reserves have been created in areas that are beautiful areas. So areas that have lush green mountains, lakes, beaches. Example, the Dachigam National Park in Srinagar. It's a very beautiful area. So earlier when kings wanted to make a reserve, they would choose a very beautiful serene environment and create a reserve. Or we could create reserves in those areas that have a high species diversity. So we can use our knowledge of ecology or our understanding of ecology to say that we should create a reserve in an area that has a high species diversity, so that we can conserve a large number of species if we create a reserve. An example is the Silent Valley National Park in Kerala. So this area has a very high species diversity. Or another way of creating a reserve is those areas that harbor unique animals. So for instance, we have this Gir National Park in Sasan, Gujarat, because we have lions there. So the only reason we have this national park there is that we have this unique animal lion that is not found anywhere else. So these were three ways in which traditionally we have been creating reserves, but then these could become very haphazard and based on the whims and fancies of the reserve creator. For instance, if I am not interested in lions and probably I had to set up this reserve, I could even say that lions are not important for us, let us create a reserve for say gharials. Now gharials are also important species, lions are also important species, but then I can make a decision that I should have a reserve where we have gharials and not lions, and somebody else may say that we should have a reserve where we have lions and not gharials. Now is there a way, can we use our ecological understanding to reduce this amount of whims and fanciness, so that everybody can come to a common platform, and so the process of reserve creation becomes more and more systematized. So now we will look at the scientific ways of creating reserves.